There are men who see what others refuse to look at, not because they are smarter, not because they are braver, but because something happened to them, something quiet and cold and almost final that burned away every comfortable illusion they had ever carried about the world. Caleb Holt was that kind of man. And in the spring of 1876, on a stretch of Dakota territory that the wind treated like a personal enemy, he began doing something that would make every person who knew him question whether he had finally lost his grip on reality. He began digging a hole in the side of a hill. Not a grave, not a well, not anything that had a name people recognized or a purpose people understood. Just a hole, getting deeper every day, getting wider every week, hidden behind his cabin like a secret he wasn't ready to tell. He knew exactly what he was building. He also knew exactly what people would say when they found out. So he kept digging, and he kept quiet, and he waited for the world to catch up to what he already understood. Caleb had come to Dakota Territory in 1872. He was 43 years old that year, a lean, deliberate man with hands that had been building things since he was 12 years old in rural Ohio. Hands that knew the weight of timber before it was cut. Hands that could read the grain of a board in the way other men read words on a page. He had been a carpenter for 30 years. He had built homes, barns, church halls, and schoolhouses across 3 counties. He understood wood the way a doctor understands the human body, not just the surface of it, but the interior, the weakness, the slow failures that happen long before anything fell apart. He could look at a joint and know whether it would hold for 10 years or for 10 months. He could feel the difference between a beam that was sound and a beam that was lying about being sound. He came to Dakota Territory alone. His wife, Margaret, had died in the winter of 1866. Pneumonia. She was 38 years old, and she died in the good warm house that Caleb had built with his own hands in Hardin County, Ohio, and there was nothing he could do about it. He sat with her through 4 nights while she burned and then went cold, and when it was over, he walked out to his barn in the gray January morning and stood there for a long time looking at nothing in particular and seeing everything that was no longer there. The house had been good. He had built it to last, and it had lasted, and she had died in it anyway. Not from any failure of the structure, from the particular failure of a human body meeting a winter that had its own intentions. He had understood this distinction clearly, and it had not made the understanding any easier to carry. He stayed in Ohio for 6 more years, kept working, kept building things for other people, kept living in the house where Margaret had died because leaving felt like abandoning her, and staying felt like drowning, and there was no good answer to that particular problem. He cooked his own meals and chopped his own wood and sat in the evenings in the chair near the stove, reading whatever he could find, and the years went by the way years go by for a man who is waiting for something he cannot name. Then one morning in the spring of 1872, he sold the house, packed what he could carry, and headed west. Dakota Territory was brutal and honest in a way that suited him. The land didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Hard winters, short summers, wind that came from somewhere north of civilization and arrived with a personal grudge. The territory attracted men who had run out of reasons to stay anywhere else, and Caleb fit that description precisely. He did not come west looking for fortune or adventure or a fresh beginning in the hopeful sense that phrase usually carries. He came west because there was nothing left in the east that required his presence, and the west at least offered the possibility of hard work with clear stakes. He filed a homestead claim on a stretch of rolling grassland near the Coteau des Prairies, the great plateau that rose from the plains like a table someone had pushed up from below. The location suited his practical eye: good elevation for drainage, a south-facing slope behind the proposed cabin site, a creek within reasonable distance to the north, and a natural windbreak of scrubby cottonwood along the east edge of the property. He built his cabin himself, working alone through the summer of 1872, and by the time the first snow came that November, he had a structure that his nearest neighbor looked at with something close to reverence. That neighbor was Harlan Bauer. Harlan was 55 years old, and a German immigrant who had come to America at age 20 and spent the decades since working ground that broke other men's spirits and calling it home. He had come through Wisconsin first, then Minnesota, following the edge of the frontier, the way some men follow rivers, not because they plan to, but because the momentum of a certain kind of life carries you in a direction you don't fully choose. He had settled in Dakota Territory 6 years ago, and had built his homestead with the same square-shouldered determination he brought to everything. He was a broad, weather-hardened man with a square jaw and opinions that arrived before he did. Not unkind, not dishonest, but a man who had decided early in life that the world worked in certain fixed ways and who treated any evidence to the contrary as a personal affront rather than as information worth considering. His wife Edna was 52 years old and had come from Wisconsin 8 years ago with a trunk of good linens and a practical intelligence that quietly ran the Bauer household, while Harlan ran his opinions about everything else. Harlan had watched Caleb build his cabin that summer of 1872, riding by occasionally on the pretense of checking his east fence line, and had approved of what he saw. The log selection was careful. The notching was tight. The chinking was done right and worked deep into the gaps with a mix that would hold through the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed careless work within a single season. Good tight logs, Harlan told Edna that fall, nodding toward Caleb's property. That man knows what he's doing. It was the highest compliment Harlan Bauer was capable of giving to another man's work. He did not hand it out often, and when he did, he expected it to be understood as the significant thing it was. The other neighbors in this stretch of territory were Gunnar Strand and Aldous Denton. Gunnar was 60 years old, a Norwegian who had come to Dakota Territory in 1864 and survived 12 winters that would have finished most men. He was tall and angular with white hair, gone the color of old birch bark, and pale eyes that had seen enough hard weather to make him slow to alarm and slower to speak. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who said things he wasn't sure of. In a community where talk was the primary entertainment during the long months when the ground was frozen and the days were short, Gunnar's silence carried its own kind of weight. People noticed when he spoke. They noticed when he didn't. His wife Britta was 58 years old and had the direct, unornamented manner of a woman who had spent decades in a hard country and had long since lost patience with anything that wasted time. She was not unkind. She was efficient in the way that survival in difficult circumstances makes some people efficient, stripped of excess, focused on what mattered, capable of warmth when warmth was warranted, and incapable of pretending when it wasn't. Aldous Denton was 50 years old and occupied the informal role of community authority, not through any official position, but through the particular combination of confidence and condescension that often passes for leadership in small, isolated settlements. He had come to Dakota Territory from Illinois 8 years ago with a larger stake than most, a better initial cabin, and the social instincts of a man who understood that in a small community, being seen as the person who understood things was a form of power worth cultivating. He had opinions about everything and the social standing to make those opinions stick. He was not cruel. He was something more insidious, he was certain. And certainty in a man with social standing has a way of becoming the weather that everyone else lives inside. These three men, Harlan Bauer, Gunnar Strand, Aldous Denton, were Caleb's nearest neighbors. In a territory where the nearest town was a half-day's ride in good conditions and a day's hard travel, in anything less than that, neighbors were the entire social world. You worked with them at harvest because the work required more hands than one man had. You borrowed tools from them and returned tools to them, and the borrowing and returning was a form of social currency that kept the community functional. You checked on them after hard storms and expected them to check on you. You were in the most fundamental sense each other's survival network, which made what happened in the spring of 1876 complicated, because Caleb started building something he didn't tell them about. It began on a morning in mid-March when the ground was still frozen 3 feet down, but the worst of winter had passed and the sunlight had returned to the angle that felt like a promise rather than an insult. Caleb had been planning it since the previous January. He had spent the 2 winters before that thinking through the general concept in the long quiet hours when the temperature made outdoor work impossible and there was nothing to do but feed the fire and think. But January 1876 was when the thinking became specific, when the idea stopped being an abstraction. He turned over in his mind and became a set of dimensions, a list of materials, a sequence of construction steps that he worked through from beginning to end, the way he always worked through a building project until every detail was resolved before the first shovel of earth was moved. He knew the location, the south-facing hillside 30 yards behind his cabin, where the slope was steep enough to allow a proper ceiling height without excessive excavation from above, and where the orientation would capture enough solar warmth to keep the surface temperature of the hillside slightly higher than the surrounding ground. He had observed this hillside through 2 full winters and knew its behavior. He knew the dimensions 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hill, and 8 feet from floor to ceiling. Large enough to be genuinely livable for an extended period. Compact enough that a small stove could maintain it at a survivable temperature with minimal fuel. He knew the materials sod bricks for the walls cut from the hillside itself and stacked with the density and care of good masonry work. Heavy timber for the roof supports salvaged lumber he had been quietly accumulating for 2 years, acquiring pieces here and there without any single acquisition being large enough to attract notice. Sheet iron for the stove, a ventilation system designed to keep the air breathable without advertising the location of the structure to anyone looking at the hillside from outside. He had thought about the hidden entrance, the false wall in his main cabin, the covered passage between the structures. He had thought about every detail the way he thought about every building project, completely from the foundation to the finish, because a building project begun without complete thinking was a building project that would teach you its problems at the worst possible moment. He started digging on a Tuesday in mid-March. When Harlan Bauer rode by 2 days later and asked what he was doing, Caleb straightened up, leaned on his shovel, and said, "Root cellar. Got more potatoes than I know what to do with come fall." Harlan nodded. A root cellar made complete sense. Many homesteaders built them into hillsides for exactly that purpose. The constant temperature underground preserved vegetables through winter better than any above-ground storage could. It was practical. It was ordinary. It was exactly the kind of sensible thing that a skilled carpenter turned homesteader would think to do. "Want help digging?" Harlan asked. "I'm good," Caleb said, "but thank you." Harlan rode on, and Caleb went back to work. Through March and into April, Caleb dug. He worked methodically, removing earth in a measured way that managed the excavation without causing the hillside above to shift and settle wrong. He had seen men dig cellars carelessly and watch the earth fold in on them like a slow hand closing. He had seen the particular stillness that followed such a collapse, and he had no intention of contributing to that category of events. He braced as he went, using the salvaged timbers he had been accumulating, positioning them with the precision of a man who understood load distribution the way other men understood breathing. Not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a physical logic that his hands had absorbed over 30 years of working with wood and stone and the weight of things. By the end of April, the hole in the hill was no longer a hole. It was a room, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the earth, 8 feet from the floor, which he had leveled and packed until it was as flat and firm as any floor he had laid above ground, to the ceiling of heavy timber beams covered with a layer of brush sod and 3 feet of packed earth above that. The walls were lined with sod bricks he cut from the hillside itself, stacked with the same careful craftsmanship he brought to every surface he had ever worked. Each brick was fitted precisely against the next. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base and tapered only slightly toward the ceiling, giving them a thermal mass that no log wall could match. A small cast-iron stove sat in the near corner, its stovepipe running up and angling through the hillside in a concealed passage, the vent opening at the surface disguised with stacked stone, arranged to look like a natural rock outcropping of the kind common on this section of the coteau. A second shaft provided fresh air circulation from a different point on the slope, hidden by a low wooden housing covered with native grasses that had already begun to regrow around it by late spring. Shelves lined 2 walls built from lumber he had milled himself, already beginning to hold the first of what would become months of carefully chosen supplies. A simple bunk frame occupied one corner, built low and solid. Wooden pegs on the wall held blankets and tools. A small wooden box on the lowest shelf would hold the medical kit when he brought it in. And then there was the passage, a covered walkway 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, connecting the underground room to the back wall of Caleb's main cabin through an opening concealed behind a section of interior wall planking that could be moved aside. The planking was fitted to its frame with the same precision Caleb brought to finish carpentry. No gaps, no looseness, nothing to suggest to a casual eye that it was anything other than what it appeared to be: solid interior wall. From the outside, the covered passage was buried under sowing and native grasses and was invisible unless you were standing directly on top of it and had been told what you were standing on. Caleb had built the passage last, working on it in the early mornings and late evenings, when the light was low and the chance of anyone passing by was minimal. He was not certain the secrecy could be maintained indefinitely. He was certain that the longer he had before the discovery happened, the more complete the structure would be when the conversation he had been mentally rehearsing finally arrived. By the end of May, the structure was complete enough to be discovered. And it was discovered on a morning in late May when Harlan Bauer came by to return a draw knife he had borrowed 3 weeks earlier, took one look at the hillside behind Caleb's weapon nest, and went very still. That, Harlan said, is not a root cellar. He was standing at the entrance to the underground room, which was framed with timbers and covered with a hinged door of thick planking faced with sod on its exterior surface. He had pulled the door open and stepped partway down the entry, 4 steps cut into the earth and reinforced with timber risers, and was staring into a space that was clearly unmistakably built for human beings to live in. Caleb was standing behind him, saying nothing. Harlan stepped back out. He turned around and looked at Caleb with an expression that had not yet settled on what it was feeling, somewhere between alarm and calculation, with something else underneath both of those that he was not yet ready to identify. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. "Nobody," Caleb said. Harlan looked back at the entrance, then back at Caleb, then made the decision that Caleb had known he would make. "I'm getting Gunnar and Aldous." Caleb didn't stop him. He had known this moment was coming since March. He had thought through every version of it, had rehearsed what he would say and what he would not say, had considered the different ways the conversation might go, and what responses would advance understanding and what responses would foreclose it. He was ready for the conversation. He was less certain that being ready was going to be enough. The 3 men arrived within the hour. Harlan Gunnar Strand and Aldous Denton stood at the entrance to the underground room in the May afternoon sunshine and looked into the darkness beyond the threshold, the way men look at something they don't have a category for, with a specific kind of stillness that is not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of minds working fast on insufficient information. Gunnar went down the steps first, slow and careful, his head nearly brushing the timber frame at the entry. He stood inside for a long moment, turning in a slow circle, examining the walls, the ceiling, supports, the stove, the shelves. His eyes moved with the methodical attention of a man who is genuinely looking, rather than merely seeing. Aldous followed, then Harlan. Caleb came down last and stood near the steps, watching their faces. The walls were sod bricks 2 feet thick, laid with the same precision Caleb had used building every structure in his life. The ceiling beams were positioned at intervals that the load they were carrying demanded 3 feet of earth above them, plus whatever snow might accumulate in a hard winter, plus the occasional footstep of an animal crossing the hillside without knowing what was below. The ventilation system was visible to anyone who looked for it, the stovepipe running up and angling through the hillside to its disguised exterior, opening the fresh air shaft marked by a small wooden register on the wing wall that could be opened or closed to manage airflow. The shelves were partially stocked already. Dried beans in cloth sacks, salt pork sealed in a crock, cornmeal in a lidded tin, dried apple, a tin of matches, a supply of lamp oil and spare wicking material. 2 wool blankets folded on the bunk, the beginnings of a medical kit in a wooden box on the lowest shelf. And at the far end of the room, the passage. It was Gunnar who noticed it first. He had moved to the back wall and was examining the timber framing of the opening with the careful attention he gave to everything structural. "Where does that go?" he asked, pointing at the 3-foot-wide opening framed with timbers leading into darkness in the direction of the main cabin. "To my cabin," Caleb said, "through a covered walkway. The other end is behind a false section of interior wall." The 3 men looked at each other. It was Aldous Denton who spoke first, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is now simply announcing the conclusion he has reached. "Caleb, what exactly have you built here?" "Emergency shelter," Caleb said. "Backup dwelling in case the main cabin fails." "Backup dwelling." "Yes." Aldous turned slowly, taking in the full dimensions of the space. "This is professional work. You've spent months on this." "Since March. And 3 months of hard labor for a shelter you hope you'll never use." Aldous looked at him directly. "Why, Mom?" And this was the moment Caleb had been rehearsing since January. The moment he had turned over in his mind more times than he could count during the long, quiet months of planning and digging and building in near secrecy. He had thought carefully about how to explain it in a way that would make sense to men who had survived the same winters he had survived and drawn entirely different conclusions from the experience. He wasn't certain he could bridge that gap, but he had to make the attempt. January 1873, Caleb said. Do you remember that cold? The three men were quiet for a moment. The question had reached something. 42 below, Gunner Strand said. His voice was flat and exact. 6 straight days. 6 days, Caleb agreed. Do you remember what you did to stay warm? We used more firewood, Harlan said. It was a hard stretch. Everyone used more that winter. I burned in 3 weeks of firewood in 6 days, Caleb said. I burned through everything I had cut and split and stacked before the first snow that year. On the 5th day, I started burning furniture. Chairs first, then the small table near the stove. On the 6th day, I was wearing every piece of clothing I owned, layered sitting 3 feet from the stove, and I was still hypothermic. My hands had stopped working properly. My thinking was beginning to slow in the way that thinking slows when the body is pulling heat from the brain to protect the core organs. I recognized what was happening to me because I had seen it happen to other men. He let that settle for a moment before continuing. My cabin was solid. The logs were good. The chinking was sound. I had built that cabin myself, and I knew every inch of it was done correctly. And it was failing. Not because I had built it wrong. Because there are conditions under which any log cabin will fail when the temperature and wind combine to pull heat out of a structure faster than any fire can replace it, the structure fails. It doesn't matter how well it was built. The physics don't negotiate. It fails. Harlan Bauer made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. Something in between those two things pressed down by something heavier that he was not prepared to name. You survived, Aldous said. The temperature broke on the 6th night, not because I was doing anything right, because the weather changed on its own. Caleb paused, letting that distinction carry its weight. The weather saved me, not my cabin. And the winter of 75, Gunner said quietly. He was looking at Caleb with an expression that was more attentive than the others. The look of a man who has moved from the category of observer to the category of person, genuinely considering whether what he is hearing is true. December 1875. A blizzard with winds strong enough to tear the shingles from my roof in the first 4 hours. Snow got into the attic space through the damaged section. Within 2 hours, my cabin was filling with cold air and drifting snow faster than I could compensate for. I spent 48 hours in a structure that had effectively become an outdoor shelter. The fire could not overcome what the structure had become. He paused. Same result as 73. The weather broke, not my preparations. But you survived both times, Aldous said. His tone had shifted slightly. The certainty was still there, but it was working harder now to hold its position. I survived both times because the weather broke, Caleb said with a patience he did not entirely feel, but had decided in advance to maintain. Not because my shelter was adequate. And I finally understood something after that second winter that I could not stop thinking about. I cannot depend on a single structure to keep me alive in extreme conditions. Cabins fail, roofs tear, chinking fails. Stoves cannot compensate for structural failure when the failure reaches a certain threshold. I needed insurance, a backup, something that would work when the main structure stopped working. The three men were quiet again, looking at the underground room around them. Caleb watched their face and saw the thought process happening in each of them, the part where the logic made sense and then the part where the emotional reality of what they were standing in pushed back against that logic with the specific force that reality reserves for things that challenge what we have already decided to believe. Gunner was the most careful. His pale eyes moved over the construction details with the systematic attention of a man conducting a genuine assessment, the beams spacing the wall thickness, the ventilation design, the relationship between the stove's capacity and the room's volume. He was doing what he always did, looking at the thing itself rather than at what he felt about the thing. Aldous was the least patient with the logic. His face had settled into an expression of troubled certainty, the look of a man who has already reached his conclusion and is now waiting for the conversation to end so he can begin acting on it. And Harlan Bauer. Harlan was the one Caleb watched most carefully, because Harlan's face was doing something different from the other two. It was not skepticism. It was not the open, methodical evaluation that Gunnar was performing. It was something tighter and more internal, a closing rather than an opening. The look of a man who is hearing something that connects directly to a memory he has kept in a closed room for 3 years, and the connection is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is expressing itself as the particular kind of anger that men use to keep uncomfortable truths at a distance. "Why hide it?" Harlan said. His voice had an edge to it that had not been there when he arrived. "If this is just emergency preparation, why build it in secret? Why not tell people? Why not ask for help and do it openly?" "Because I knew exactly how you would react," Caleb said. "Look at your faces right now. Not one of you is seeing a practical backup plan. You're seeing something wrong, something hidden. Something that a man only builds if he knows something you don't, or if he's preparing for something dark that he doesn't want to explain." He paused. "Am I wrong?" Nobody answered. The silence was its own kind of answer. If I had come to any of you in March and said, "I'm going to build a secret underground shelter into the hillside behind my cabin, because I believe my cabin could fail in extreme weather and I need a backup," what would you have said? Would you have said, "Good idea, Caleb, that's very sensible. Let me help you dig"? He looked at each of them in turn. Or would you have said exactly what you're all thinking right now? Aldous opened his mouth, closed it again. "Exactly," Caleb said. "So I built it quietly. That is the whole of it. No dark purpose, no hidden meaning. I am preparing to survive weather that has already nearly killed me twice. Nothing more than that." Gunnar Strand spent another few minutes examining the construction in silence after that exchange. He ran his hand along a section of sod wall, testing the fit between bricks. He ducked under a ceiling beam and checked the connection between a vertical support post and the horizontal member it was carrying. He went to the stovepipe and looked at the angle, the gauge of the metal, the seal where it entered the concealed vent channel. "This is good work," he said finally. His voice was flat and factual, the highest register of praise that men of his particular character allow themselves. "The beam spacing is correct for the load. The ventilation design is sound. The wall mass is sufficient." He straightened up and looked at Caleb directly. "I don't know yet whether you're right about cabins failing in the way you describe, but whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing." "I built it," Caleb said. Gunnar nodded once. "I know you did." Aldous Denton was less interested in the engineering details. He was already composing the conversation he was going to have with his wife that evening, and the conversations that would follow from that one, moving outward through the small community, the way information always moved in isolated places quickly and with the specific distortions that each person applied based on what they needed the story to mean for their own purposes. "People are going to find out about this," Aldous said. "I expect so," Caleb said. "And when they do, they're going to wonder what you're really preparing for." Aldous looked at him with the steady certainty of a man delivering an assessment he has already completed. "You understand that. A man building a secret underground room with a hidden passage into his cabin that looks like a man with dangerous secrets, regardless of what the truth actually is." "I understand how it looks," Caleb said. "Then you understand why I'm concerned." "I understand why you're concerned," Caleb said. "I also understand that the weather that already nearly killed me will come back. It comes back every several years. It comes back with regularity, and every time it comes back, people are surprised by it, and some of those people die." He looked at Gunnar. "How long have you been in Dakota Territory?" 12 years, Gunnar said, "since '64. "And in 12 years, how many extreme weather events have you survived?" Gunnar considered this with the honesty he brought to all questions. "Several. The winter of '68 was very bad. '73, as you said. Bad blizzards scattered through the other years as well. So extreme weather is not a rare exception. It's a regular feature of this place. It comes back on a cycle of a few years." Caleb looked at all three of them in turn. "And every time it comes back, people are surprised. Cabins fail. Some people die. And the following summer, everyone rebuilds the same kind of cabin and waits for the same thing to happen again in a few years." He paused. "I'm done being surprised. I'm done waiting." The three men left that afternoon. Caleb stood at the entrance to the underground room and watched them ride away across the May grassland, Harlan Bauer's broad back straight in the saddle, carrying a stiffness that had not been there when he arrived. Gunner Strand's angular figure moving in easy rhythm with his horse, his face turned slightly toward the horizon in the way of a man still working something through. Aldous Denton, already gesturing to himself, already composing the account he would give. Caleb had expected the visit. He had planned for it. He understood that the social cost of what he was building was going to be real, that a community this small and this isolated would not simply absorb a secret underground structure and move on without consequence. He had decided during the months of planning that the cost was worth paying. What he had not quite planned for was the particular way Harlan Bauer had looked during that last exchange. Not with simple disbelief, not with the alarm that accompanied genuine incomprehension, with something that looked, if you knew what to look for, and Caleb had spent 30 years learning what to look for in structures under stress, very much like recognition fighting against itself. By June, the story had spread through every homestead within reasonable distance. Not in the way that accurate things spread clean and unadorned. It spread the way things always spread, through small, isolated communities with additions that served the teller's purposes, with omissions that simplified the complicated parts, with the particular coloring that each person applied based on what they needed the story to mean. Some people heard that Caleb Holt had built an underground bunker, connected to his cabin by a secret tunnel, and was stockpiling supplies like a man expecting a siege. Some people heard he had lost his mind from too many winters spent alone, that the isolation had done something to his thinking, that isolation sometimes does to men without enough human contact to keep them calibrated. Some people heard he was hiding from something that had followed him from Ohio, a debt, a history, a trouble that had a name he didn't want used in his presence. A few people decided quietly that it didn't matter what his reason was. A man who built secrets into his property was a man worth keeping your distance from on general principle. When Caleb came into the nearest trading post for supplies that summer, conversations paused as he entered and resumed in different registers when he left. When there was farm work to be done and neighbors would ordinarily have offered help without being asked, the offers came less frequently and with a quality of reservation that hadn't been there before. The small daily rituals of community life, the shared meals after collective work, the casual visits that served no particular purpose beyond human contact in a landscape that offered very little of it, the easy back and forth of people who have decided they can rely on each other thinned out and went cooler. Caleb noticed all of this. He was not a man who failed to notice things. He did not try to fight it. There was a version of this situation in which he went from homestead to homestead and explained his reasoning until enough people understood it to turn the social tide. He had considered that version carefully. He had rejected it not out of pride and not out of indifference to what people thought of him, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the explanation would not accomplish what he needed it to accomplish. Not because the explanation was wrong, but because people do not fundamentally revise their understanding of things based on words alone, no matter how logical those words are. They revise it based on experience. And the experience that would revise their understanding of this particular thing was coming whether he campaigned for their belief or not. He could feel it in the way the summer dried out faster than usual, the grasses going brown a week earlier than the year before, in the way the birds moved south 3 weeks earlier than they had moved the previous fall, in the way the old-timers at the trading post went quiet when they talked about the coming winter and looked at the sky with expressions that mixed the pattern recognition of long experience with the particular unease that comes from recognizing a pattern you hoped you wouldn't see again. Something was coming. Caleb Holt was going to be ready for it. He spent the summer finishing what he had started. He stocked the underground room's shelves with the deliberation of a man who has thought through a long list of scenarios and is accounting for each of them. Enough food for 2 months balanced between caloric density and weight, and variety sufficient to prevent the particular mental deterioration that comes from eating the same thing day after day. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, hardtack, dried apple and dried plum. A good supply of tea because hot liquid in cold conditions is a medical necessity as much as a comfort. Salt enough for preservation and flavoring both. He brought in enough firewood for the compact underground stove to last 6 weeks of continuous burning cut, small split fine stacked with the same precision he brought to everything, because imprecise stacking was how you ended up burning more wood than you needed to and running short at the wrong time. He installed the bunk properly with a rope support base and a corn husk mattress he had ticked himself from material he already had. He added a second set of blankets, heavy wool good quality, the kind that retained warmth even when damp, a lantern, and two full extra fonts of oil. A book just won the practical guide to carpentry he had carried west from Ohio because the mind needs occupation as much as the body needs warmth, and a mind with nothing to do in a confined space will begin to manufacture its own trouble. He tested the ventilation system on a cold September morning, lighting the stove and monitoring the airflow through both shafts for 4 hours, adjusting the dampers until the balance between heat retention and fresh air circulation was exactly what he needed. He tested the passage between the underground room and the main cabin, moving through it in darkness, counting steps, adjusting the hinge mechanism on the false wall panel until it opened and closed smoothly and silently in under 2 seconds, without requiring any light to operate. He was thorough. He was methodical. He was by any objective measure completely prepared for something that nobody else believed was coming. Then he closed up the entrance, covered it with fresh sod and native grasses, and waited for winter to arrive. Fall came early that year. First snow on October 15th, not unusual for Dakota Territory in itself. But by November 1st, the territory had already cycled through 3 serious cold snaps with temperatures dropping below zero, and they came with a frequency and severity that the early October cold had not suggested. Old-timers at the trading post spoke in low voices. They talked about the angle of the wind and the way the storm clouds sat on the northwest horizon and the particular color of the sky at dusk that they had seen before and did not welcome seeing again. Caleb Holt listened to them and said nothing. He went home and checked his firewood supply for the main cabin. He checked his food stores. He checked the stove and the stovepipe and the chinking around every log in the structure, running his hands along the exterior walls in the November afternoon, feeling for gaps the way a doctor feels for fever, with specific attention and a defined purpose. Then he walked around to the back of the cabin, crouched down, and pulled aside a small section of sod at the edge of the covered passage entrance. The timber frame below was solid. The door fit its frame cleanly. The sod over the entrance had taken hold well. He covered it back over. He stood up and looked at the hillside. From 30 feet away, it looked like any other section of south-facing Dakota slope in November brown grass, a few rocks, the ordinary topography of high plains country settling into winter. Nothing to see, nothing to find unless you knew exactly where to look and had been told exactly what you were looking for. Caleb Holt turned and walked back to his cabin. He had built his backup. He had built it in secret because he understood what people thought of a man who built one openly. He had built it alone because some preparations can only be made by the person who fully understands the need, who has felt the specific cold that the preparation is designed to answer. And now he waited. Because the thing he knew with complete certainty, the thing that 30 years of working with wood and watching structures fail had taught him in the way only direct experience teaches, was that the moment of structural failure never announced itself when conditions were favorable and help was available and a man had time to think. It arrived in the middle of the night. It arrived when the temperature was at its lowest and the wind was at its peak, and the distance between a man and help was at its greatest. It arrived exactly when you were least prepared for it, unless you had already prepared. Unless you had dug your hole in the hill and stocked your shelves and tested your ventilation and practiced moving through the dark passage until every step of what came next was so deep in your body that you could execute it without thought, without light, without the luxury of time to think through what you were doing. The winter of 1876 came to Dakota Territory in early December, and it came with a particular intention. Caleb Holt was ready. The rest of the territory was not. There is a particular kind of silence that comes before a catastrophe, not the silence of peace, not the silence of a winter morning when new snow has muffled the world into something soft and temporarily forgiving. This silence is different in its character, tighter, more pressurized, the way the air feels in the seconds before a lightning strike, when every living thing within range understands on some level below conscious thought that something fundamental is about to change, and that the change will not be small. Caleb Holt felt that silence on the morning of December 9th. He woke before dawn as he always did and lay still for a moment, listening to the cabin the way a man listens to a sleeping child, with the specific habitual attention of someone who is responsible for what he hears and will be held accountable for what he misses. The stove had burned down to coals through the night. The temperature inside had dropped, but not dangerously. The wind was present, but not remarkable, a steady push from the northwest that rattled the window frame in the familiar, almost domestic way of ordinary December wind. He got up, fed the stove, put water on for coffee, pulled on his boots and his coat, and went outside to check the sky. What he saw made him stand very still on his front step for a long moment. The horizon to the northwest was not the ordinary gray of a December morning in this territory. It was a deeper color, a bruised yellowish dark that experienced men in this part of the world recognize the way sailors recognize a certain quality of sea before a storm. The clouds sat low and moved with a purpose and organization that casual weather does not possess. The wind that had seemed unremarkable from inside the cabin felt different against his face, colder than the temperature alone accounted for, carrying a particular quality of intent that was separate from its temperature. Caleb stood there and took it in. Then he went back inside, poured his coffee, and began preparing. He spent the morning doing what he always did before serious weather checking systems, confirming supplies, thinking through sequences in the order they would need to be executed. He added wood to the main cabin stove until it was burning hot and clean and the firebox was full. He filled the water barrel from the outside pump while the pump still worked because pumps froze, and a man who waited until he needed the water to discover the pump was frozen was a man making a bad situation worse. He checked the main cabin's firewood supply, stacked along the interior south wall. Then he went through the false wall panel into the passage and down into the underground room. He checked everything there with the same methodical attention. The stove was clean and ready. The firewood was stacked exactly as he had left it, 6 weeks of supply for the compact iron stove. The food stores were complete. The water jug was full. Both ventilation shafts were clear and functional. The lamp oil was at capacity. He came back through the passage, sealed the false wall panel behind him, and looked at the back wall of his cabin the way he always looked at it after these checks, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows that what is hidden behind it is solid and fully ready. Outside, the wind was picking up. By noon, it was serious. By 2 in the afternoon, it was something else entirely. The character of the storm changed the way a river changes when the land suddenly falls away beneath it, not gradually, not through a series of incremental steps, but by crossing some threshold where the rules that applied 1 moment ago simply stopped applying. At 2 o'clock, the snow that had been falling in a steady, unremarkable way since mid-morning became something harder and more driven, moving nearly horizontal, converting the middle distance into a uniform white nothing. The wind that had been building through the morning made a sound against the cabin walls that Caleb had not heard in 4 years of Dakota winters. Not howling, not the theatrical sound that people who have not experienced a real blizzard associate with one. A sustained, pressurized roar. The sound of something enormous moving against the structure from every direction simultaneously. The sound of air that has decided to dismantle whatever is standing in its way and is applying consistent organized force to that purpose. By 4 in the afternoon, visibility outside the window was absolute zero. There was nothing beyond the glass but white moving so fast it registered as a solid surface. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 15 below and was falling with the steady, purposeful quality of something that had not yet reached where it was going. Caleb built his fire as high as the stove safely allowed and sat in the chair near it, watching the single window which showed nothing but darkness and the transmitted sound of the world coming apart at its seams a few feet beyond the glass. He was not afraid. He had been afraid during the winter of 1873 when he had not understood what was happening until he was already deep in it. He had been afraid during the winter of 1875 when the roof tore and the cold came into the cabin faster than his ability to comprehend the rate of change. Fear had been the appropriate response in both those situations, fear in the presence of something you cannot control and have not prepared for. This was different. He sat and listened to the storm and measured it against his preparations, the way a man measures a load against the structure designed to carry it. He found for the first time in several Dakota winters that his preparations were adequate, more than adequate. There was something 30 yards across that hillside that this storm could not reach and could not touch. And if the moment came when he needed it, it was 30 yards away and less than a minute from now. He ate his supper. He read for a while by lantern light. He kept the fire and checked the window every hour. Around midnight, he went to bed. He woke at 3 in the morning to a sound that he recognized before he was fully awake. Not consciously recognized. Not the recognition of a mind that is alert and processing. The deeper recognition of a man who has thought carefully about what can go wrong, who has run the sequence so many times that the alarm, when it finally arrives, does not come as surprise but as the confirmation of something he has been waiting for, without quite admitting to himself that he was waiting. The sound was wood. Not the sound of wood contracting in cold, the small, irregular ticks and pops that a cabin makes through winter nights as the logs respond to temperature changes, sounds so familiar they cease to register as sounds at all. This was a different register. Lower, more resonant, more structural. The sound of wood speaking about the limits of the load it was carrying, the way materials speak when they are at the edge of what they can do. A groan deep and slow and wrong in a way that his body understood before his mind had completed the analysis. Caleb was out of his bunk before the sound finished. He grabbed the lantern from the bedside shelf already filled and trimmed because he had filled and trimmed it that morning when he was checking everything else, struck a match, and climbed the short ladder into the attic space without stopping to put on his boots. The attic was cold enough to make his eyes water the moment he entered it. He held the lantern up and moved it in a slow arc across the ceiling space, looking for the source of what he had heard. The lantern light moved over the rough underside of the roof boards, the cross bracing he had installed when he built the cabin, and then the main beam, the central structural element that ran the full length of the cabin along its center line, carrying the ridge load and transferring it to the end walls. He found the fracture in the middle third of that beam. Not a surface check, not the ordinary splitting that dry timber develops over seasons as the wood dries and its internal stresses redistribute. This was a structural fracture running across the upper face of the beam at an angle that an experienced carpenter could read the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The accumulated weight of snow above days of snowfall compacted by the wind into a load heavier than any normal winter would produce, combined with the lateral wind load pressing against the roof from the northwest, had concentrated stress at the center span of the beam until the wood's capacity to carry that stress had been exceeded. As Caleb held the lantern steady and looked at the fracture, the beam made another sound. A slow, drawn-out groan that seemed to come from the full length of it, the sound of material that has reached its absolute limit and is no longer holding by design, but by the narrow margin between where it is and where complete failure begins. Caleb held the lantern steady and looked at the fracture for exactly the amount of time that was necessary to understand it completely. Then he came back down the ladder. He moved the way he had practiced, not frantically, not slowly. With the precise economical speed of a man executing a plan, he has rehearsed 100 times. Who knows that every motion that is not purposeful is motion that costs him time he may not have. Boots first, then coat, hat, gloves. The cold, coming through the ceiling crack, was already measurable in the cabin air, the temperature dropping in the way it drops when a structure has been breached. He pulled the emergency pack from under his bunk, kept ready since October, already containing the irreplaceable things, the medical kit, the fire-starting materials, the lamp oil, the document roll with his homestead claim papers wrapped in oilcloth. He moved through the cabin with the lantern, adding the designated items to the pack. Extra wool socks, the tin of matches from the kitchen shelf, the small cloth sack of coffee beans, because small comforts matter more in difficult situations than most people give them credit for. He carried the pack to the back wall of the cabin. He pressed the lower left corner of the false wall panel, the release point he had positioned so that his hand would find it in complete darkness without having to search. The panel swung inward on its wooden hinges, silent and clean, exactly as it had operated in every practice run since August. The passage beyond was dark and cold. He tossed the pack through, first heard it land on the earthen floor of the passage. Then he went back for firewood, not all of it, but a substantial armful of the best cut pieces, the ones that would light fast and burn steady. Then back again for the food sack he kept packed on the kitchen shelf, another preparation that had seemed like excess caution in October, and now seemed like exactly what it had always been. 3 trips, 15 minutes. The roof beam groaned again as he made the last trip, a longer sound this time, deeper with the particular quality of wood announcing that the remaining margin between its current state and complete failure had become very small. He stood at the false wall panel with the lantern and looked back at his cabin, the main cabin, the one he had built with his own hands in the summer of 1872. The good solid structure that his nearest neighbor had looked at and said those words, good tight logs that man knows what he's doing, that had meant more to Caleb at the time than he had let show. The structure that every person in this community pointed to as evidence that Caleb Holt was a craftsman worth the name. The roof was going to come down. Not might come down, was going to come down. The beam had spoken, and Caleb knew how to listen to beams, and what it had said was not ambiguous. He went through the panel, pulled it shut behind him, moved through the passage in complete darkness, by memory and by feel, right hand trailing the timber frame on the north side feet, finding the slight grade of the earthen floor 6 feet of passage, and then the 3 steps down into the underground room. He closed the door behind him. The difference was immediate and total. In the passage and then in the room, the roar of the storm simply ceased. Not diminished, not reduced to a lower level. Ceased. The underground room was enclosed by 2 feet of sod brick on every wall and 3 feet of compacted earth above the ceiling, and the earth did not transmit the sound of surface wind. The roar that had been the defining condition of the world for the past 15 hours was gone as completely as if a door had been closed between Caleb and the storm itself. In its place, silence. The silence of deep earth. Old silence. The kind that has been there since before anyone built anything on the surface above it, completely indifferent to whatever was happening up there now. The temperature in the room was 42 degrees, the natural thermal equilibrium of the surrounding earth at this depth and at this latitude in December. Cold enough to see your breath in the lantern light, not cold enough to be dangerous, not remotely close to dangerous. Caleb set the lantern on the shelf and knelt at the small iron stove. He laid the fire with the same care he brought to every fire he had ever built in his life. Tinder first positioned correctly for airflow, then small splits laid in a structure that would draw well, then a single larger piece set where it would catch before it was needed to do serious work. He struck a match. The tinder caught cleanly. The small splits caught within seconds. He adjusted the damper, sat back on his heels and watched the fire establish itself in the way fires establish themselves when they are built correctly in a space designed to contain them. Within 30 minutes, the underground room was warm, not the aggressive compensatory heat of a main cabin stove, fighting a losing battle against structural failure and negative temperatures. A steady, moderate, genuinely sustainable warmth, the warmth of a small fire in a well-insulated space, doing exactly what it was designed to do, without fighting, without strain, without the quality of desperation that had characterized every fire Caleb had built during the winters of 1873 and 1875. He sat on the edge of the bunk and felt something leave his shoulders that had been accumulating there since October. Not relief exactly, something quieter than relief, the specific hard-won piece of a man who has prepared for a thing, and the thing has arrived, and the preparations have held. Above him, the storm continued its work. He could hear nothing of it. He did not sleep immediately. He sat in the warm underground room with the lantern turned low and listened to what was and was not audible. Through the ventilation shaft, the fresh air intake on the back slope of the hill fitted with a wooden register, he could partially close against the wind. There came the faintest transmission of the surface world. Not the sound of the storm itself, but its effect on the exterior of the vent, housing the intermittent percussion of ice crystals, driven at sustained force against the concealed opening, a sound that told him the wind was still moving at the same level of sustained violence it had reached at the height of the storm. He sat with that information for a while, measuring it against what it meant for the structure above. Then at a few minutes past 2 in the morning, he heard something that was not in the range of things the ventilation shaft had ever transmitted to him before. It came through the shaft gradually, the way distant sounds come through distance, not clearly, not fully formed, but with enough of its original character intact to be recognizable as what it was. Rhythmic, irregular in the specific way that human action is irregular, rather than the way mechanical or natural processes are irregular. 2 impacts, then a pause, then 2 more. The pattern of a hand striking a surface with deliberate force. The pattern of someone trying to be heard above something that was making it very difficult to be heard. It was coming from the direction of Harlan Bauer's property. Caleb sat completely still and listened. The sound came again, then again. then stopped entirely for long enough that he might have convinced himself it had been wind interacting with a loose board at exactly the wrong frequency, except that he had spent 4 months learning the range of what this ventilation shaft transmitted, and he knew every sound in that range, and this was not in it. He sat on the edge of the bunk and put both hands flat on his thighs and thought with the full unsparing attention that the situation required. He thought about distance first. Harlan Bauer's cabin was roughly a quarter mile to the east. In normal conditions, a 3-minute walk. Under the conditions currently existing on the surface above him, zero visibility wind at sustained catastrophic force temperature, somewhere below 30 degrees negative, and falling steadily, a quarter mile was not a distance that could be measured in minutes. It was a distance that had to be measured against the physics of what extreme cold does to a human body in a specific span of time. He had read about this years ago in a medical pamphlet a traveling doctor had left at the trading post. He had read it because he was the kind of man who read things that other men considered morbid or unnecessarily pessimistic. Exposed skin at 30 below, with high wind, frostbite in under 2 minutes, deep cold incapacitation of the extremities in under 15. Loss of coordination and judgment, the specific degradation of judgment that makes a man increasingly unable to recognize the degree of his own impairment before he has been in those conditions long enough to fully understand what is happening to him. Death from exposure in under an hour without shelter. He thought about Harlan Bauer, 55 years old, broad and physically capable under ordinary conditions. But physical capability did not change what 30 below and zero visibility did to human tissue and human judgment. Those were not conditions that capability negotiated with. He thought about the quarter mile between them across open ground with no landmarks visible, into wind he could not see through and could not hear through for any purpose beyond the roar of the wind itself moving toward a sound that might be a person trying to signal for help, and might be the wind finding a loose board at a particular resonant frequency in the debris of what had become of Harlan's cabin. He thought about what he would find if he got there, and then he put his hand on the door of the underground room. The hinged timber door that opened outward into the hillside currently faced on its exterior with 2 feet or more of compacted snowdrift. He sat with his hand on the door. The ventilation shaft went quiet. The wind had peaked again. One of the periodic surges that had been occurring all evening, swallowing everything below its own frequency. Caleb sat there. He thought about Margaret, his wife who had died in a good warm house in Ohio in January 1866, while he sat 3 feet away from her and was completely unable to do anything. He had been there, present, awake, and she had died anyway of something that had nothing to do with whether he was present and everything to do with what her body had encountered and could not overcome. He carried that with him every day in the way you carry things that do not get lighter, not as active grief, not any longer, but as a weight that had become part of the body's habitual posture, invisible because it was always there. He thought about all of it, the distance, the temperature, the physics, the memory, the sound that might be a hand and might be wind, and he sat with his hand on the door. The fire ticked in the small stove. The lantern burned with a clean, steady flame. The temperature in the room was 60 degrees and still rising. Caleb took his hand off the door. He sat back down on the bunk. He put his face in his hands and stayed like that for a long time in the warm silence of the underground room while the storm did its work above him. There are decisions that a man can explain afterward. Decisions with clean logic and visible reasoning, and outcomes that can be laid out and evaluated by anyone willing to look at them honestly. If you had gone out into 30 below and zero visibility in the middle of the worst storm in 4 years of Dakota winters to investigate a sound that might have been a hand and might have been wind, you would have died in the snow 100 yards from the door you came out of, and you would have saved no one, and there would now be one more body for someone else to find when the storm ended. If you stayed, you lived. The arithmetic is available to anyone who wants to do it. And there are decisions that live below the reach of arithmetic, that exist in a place where logic and self-preservation and old grief and the specific texture of a man's understanding of his own limitations all occupy the same dark confined space, crowding each other, none of them producing a clean answer because there is no clean answer to be had. Caleb Holt sat in the underground room he had built with his own hands and made the only decision that the available facts supported. He stayed. He stayed and he lived with that decision, and the living with it was its own particular kind of cold, different from the cold outside, but cold in the way that certain things are cold regardless of temperature. The storm continued for 3 full days. In the underground room, time moved by a different measure than it did on the surface. Without windows, without the visual cues that mark the movement of light through a day, without the social cues that mark the passage of time, and a community time became a matter of the lantern and the stove, and the body's own rhythms, hunger, tiredness, the need to move after too long in one position. He slept when he was tired. He ate when he was hungry. He kept the fire at a steady, moderate level, and the lantern trimmed to a clean flame, and he waited, and the storm worked above him, and he could not see any of it. On the morning of the second day, he knew it was morning, because he had been tracking elapsed time carefully with the pocket watch he had brought. He found while reorganizing the emergency pack he had carried through the passage, a small leather-bound book he had not consciously packed. Margaret's journal. He had not known it was in the pack. He had packed the document roll as homestead papers in their oilcloth wrapping, and the journal had been sitting behind the document roll on the same shelf, and in the 15 minutes of purposeful movement through the main cabin in the middle of the night, he had swept both into the pack without distinguishing between them in the dark. He held it for a moment. The leather was soft with age and handling. She had used it for 5 years, the last 5 years of her life, writing in it the way people write in journals that are purely for themselves, without audience, without performance, with the specific honesty that comes from writing things that no one else is expected to read. He had read it once. The winter after she died, sitting at the kitchen table in the Hardin County house on a February evening, because he had needed something of hers and the journal was what he had found. He had read it and put it away and not opened it again in 10 years. He opened it now. He did not read straight through. He turned to pages at random, the way you do when you are not looking for information, but for something less definable, for the texture of a specific voice, for the quality of a specific presence. The handwriting was even and clear. She had been a school teacher before they married, and she wrote the way she had been trained, each letter given its proper form, each line maintaining its spacing, with a consistency that was simply how she did things. He turned pages, read fragments. Her notes about the garden in the summer of 1864, about the difficult pregnancy of a neighbor woman, about the sound the barn made in high wind, and how she had always found it comforting rather than alarming, which she acknowledged was probably strange. He turned to the final pages. Her handwriting in the last entries was identical to her handwriting in the first. She had not known she was dying, or had chosen not to know it, and the choice either way had kept her voice on these pages exactly what it had always been. She wrote about the cold that January, about the firewood supply, about a dress she was planning to make. 3 entries before the last, he found the line. He had not remembered it from his reading 10 years ago. Or perhaps he had remembered it and put it in a part of his mind he did not go to often. She had written, Cal worries too much about the structure of things. The roof, the wind, the cold. I tell him this house is good. He built it himself. Sometimes I think he sees dangers that aren't there, and I wonder if I should be concerned about that tendency in him, or if it is simply the way a carpenter sees the world. Caleb sat in the underground room and read that sentence twice. Then a third time. He turned to the last entry dated 4 days before she died. Cal up again in the night, checking the stovepipe. I pretended to be asleep. He worries so. But the house is warm and there is food, and I am not afraid of this winter. I told him yesterday, stop looking for the thing that will go wrong. He smiled, but I don't think he agreed. He never agrees about this. I suppose that is one of the things that will not change about him. Caleb read that entry 3 times. Then he closed the journal carefully and set it on the shelf beside the lantern. He sat without moving for a long time. His wife had thought he worried too much, had thought he saw dangers that weren't there, had told him with the gentleness of a woman who loved the particular man she had married and understood his specific temperament, and was simply lovingly asking him to consider a different relationship with it. Stop looking for the thing that will go wrong. She had been right about the Ohio house. That house had never failed. It had stood through every winter of her life in it, and was still standing when he left it 10 years later. His fears about that house had been unfounded, and she had been right that they were unfounded. But she had not been right about the looking itself. She had been right about its excess in that specific case, and wrong about its nature. He looked at the thing that could go wrong. He had always looked. In every structure he had ever built, His eye went first to the weak point, the joint that was carrying too much, the beam that had a defect running in the wrong direction, the connection that was relying on friction when it should have been relying on bearing. This was not fear. This was not paranoia. This was not the morbid obsession of a man who had spent too many winters alone. It was the specific intelligence that 30 years of working with structures that bore loads and either held or failed had built into him, made part of his perception the same way a doctor's training makes certain things visible to a doctor that are invisible to everyone else. He had looked at what could go wrong. He had prepared for it. He had survived it. He did not know yet what the looking had cost him this time. The specific cost of those 4 nights, the sound through the ventilation shaft, the hand on the door, the decision he would not know until the storm ended and he went out into the landscape it had created. He would find out soon enough. On the morning of December 14th, the wind stopped. Not gradually. In the same sudden way it had begun 5 days ago, crossing a threshold from one condition to another without the courtesy of a transition. 1 hour, the ventilation shaft was transmitting the background percussion of wind-driven ice crystals against the exterior housing. The next hour, it was transmitting only cold air moving through in a passive, undirected way. Caleb sat up from the bunk where he had been half sleeping. He listened for 10 full minutes before he moved. He had been through 2 false lulls during the previous days, pauses of 2 to 3 hours, where the wind had dropped enough that a man might have thought the storm was over before it rebuilt itself and came back with renewed force. This was different. The silence had a quality of completion of a thing that had finished rather than a thing that was resting. He dressed fully. He checked the stove low but maintaining and banked it so it would hold heat for several hours. He took the lantern and moved to the entrance door. He pushed. The door did not move. He pushed harder and felt the resistance of compacted snow on the exterior. Not the light accumulation he had planned for in his most conservative estimate, but a dense drift that the wind had built against the south-facing hillside over 4 days and nights of sustained force. He went back for the short-handled spade he had stored in the corner near the bunk specifically for this possibility, because he was the kind of man who stored a spade near the bunk for this possibility. It took 40 minutes to clear enough snow from the exterior face of the entrance to push the door open and climb out into the Dakota morning. He stood on the surface and looked at what the storm had left behind. The snow had remade the landscape completely. The familiar features of his property, the fence line, the path to the barn, the low stretch of ground between the cabin and the tree line to the north, had been replaced by a terrain that was simultaneously the same place and a different place. Drifts chest-high in some areas, knee-high in others, shaped by the wind into forms that had their own geometry. The color of the sky was the specific pale blue that follows extreme weather in this territory, clean and cold, and utterly indifferent, offering no acknowledgement of what it had just presided over. His main cabin stood, most of it. The section he had seen failing the center span of the roof where the main beam had fractured had come down during the storm. A third of the roof surface had collapsed inward. Through the opening, snow had packed into the interior to a depth that rendered the space completely uninhabitable, not just uncomfortable, not just difficult, but physically incompatible with human survival. The temperature inside would have equalized with the outside within hours of the failure. If he had been in that cabin when the beam finally gave, he would have been in that space when the roof came down. Even if the collapse had not injured him directly, the exposure that followed would have been fatal. He stood and looked at it for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with the vindicated feeling of a man whose predictions have been confirmed, with the plain, practical acknowledgement of a man looking at physical evidence that confirms a calculation he had already made and acted on. The calculation had been correct. He had acted on it correctly. That was all there was to evaluate. Then he turned east toward Harlan Bauer's property and began walking. The snow was chest-high in the low areas. He moved through it the way he moved through everything that required sustained effort, without the option of rest, steadily with consistent force, choosing his route based on the surface variations that indicated where the ground beneath the drifts was higher and the accumulation therefore shallower. The quarter-mile to Harlan's cabin took him nearly 2 hours. What he found when he finally reached the property stopped him at the edge of it for a long moment. Harlan Bauer's cabin was gone. Not damaged, not partially standing with sections failed. Gone, the walls had come down outward from the roof, Failure, the logs splayed into the snow like the ribs of something enormous that had simply folded at its center. The chimney stack was the only element still at its original height, rising from the debris field in complete pointlessness, a column of stone with nothing left to serve. No smoke, no movement, no sound from within the debris. Caleb moved toward it and began to call. He called Harlan's name. He called Edna's name, Edna Bauer, 52 years old, who had come from Wisconsin 8 years ago, with her good linens and her practical intelligence, who had built something that resembled a real home out of raw materials and hard work, and the refusal to be diminished by difficult circumstances. No answer came from the debris field. He began to dig. He dug for 20 minutes before he found Harlan. In the northeast corner of what had been the cabin's interior, the corner farthest from the point of initial failure where the load had transferred. Last, a section of fallen roof timber had come to rest against the top of a remaining partial wall in a way that had created entirely by the accident of how things fell, a triangular void space roughly 3 feet high and 4 feet across. In that space, pressed into the lowest angle where the earthen floor met the remaining wall, Harlan Bauer was alive. Barely. His color was the specific blue-white of a man who has been very cold for a very long time. His hands, when Caleb took them, were rigid and unresponsive. His eyes opened when Caleb spoke his name, but slowly, with the effortful delay of a man returning from a very long distance to a place he wasn't certain he wanted to return to. "Can you hear me?" Caleb said. It was not phrased as a question. It was the first item in an assessment. Harlan's eyes found Caleb's face and focused. He did not speak. "I'm going to get you warm," Caleb said. Went over. "Don't try to move on your own. Let me do it." He looked around the debris field. He called Edna's name twice more with the specific quality of a man who already knows what the silence means, but who has to make the calls anyway because not making them is its own kind of failure. The property was silent. He looked at Harlan's face, at the particular collapsed quality around the eyes that was not cold and not shock, but something that combined both and went past both into a territory that had its own name. And he understood what he was not going to find when he continued searching the debris. He looked at Harlan for a moment. Then he looked away across the white Dakota landscape on the morning of December 14th, 1876, and he breathed out slowly in the cold air and watched the breath disappear. The storm had ended. The accounting was just beginning. The storm left the way it had arrived, without apology and without explanation. 1 hour the world was ending. The next hour it was simply over, and what remained was the particular stillness of a landscape that has been completely rearranged and does not yet know what it has become. The sky had gone pale blue and empty, the color of something that had spent itself entirely and was now simply present in the aftermath of its own completion. The wind was absent in the specific way of a thing that has finished its business rather than a thing that is resting. Caleb Holt stood in the debris field of Harlan Bauer's collapsed cabin, with Harlan barely conscious in the snow at his feet, and understood that the next hours were going to require him to be a different kind of man than the one he had been for the past 4 days. In the underground room, he had been the man who waited, who endured, who had prepared and was now inhabiting the result of that preparation, protected by the earth and by his own foresight while the storm did what it intended to do above him. That man's work was done. What was required now was the man who moved through damage and did not flinch from what he found, who assessed and acted without the luxury of distance or preparation or the comfort of a plan already in place. He had been that man before. In Ohio in January 1866, he had been that man. He knew how to do it. He knelt beside Harlan. Getting Harlan Bauer to shelter took the better part of an hour. The man was large and his body was not cooperating. The cold had taken his fine motor control first, as it always did, leaving him with limbs that moved only in the gross, effortful way of machinery that has been used past its tolerances. He could walk after a fashion when Caleb got him upright and kept an arm around him and set the pace. He could put one foot in front of the other. He could do very little else. Caleb had learned in 30 years of physical work that there is a state a man can reach when what the task requires exceeds what he would normally describe as his capacity, where the gap between what he can do and what he must do closes, not because his capacity increases, but because the concept of capacity stops being relevant. There is only the task and the next step of the task and the step after that. He had reached that state before. He reached it again now. He got Harlan moving. He kept him moving. He read the surface of the snow the way he read the grain of timber, not at the surface level, but at the level of what the surface told him about the structure below, choosing the route that tracked the higher ground beneath the drifts, where the accumulation was shallower and the footing more reliable. They reached Caleb's property in 40 minutes. He took Harlan directly to the underground room through the hillside entrance, not through the passage from the main cabin, which would have required navigating around the collapsed roof section. 4 steps down, the hinged door, the warmth inside the room that hit them both like something with physical weight. Harlan made a sound when the warmth reached him. Not a word, something below language, the sound a human body makes when it has been at the edge of what it can survive, and warmth becomes suddenly available again. The sound of the body recognizing that it is going to be allowed to continue. Caleb sat him on the bunk, built the fire back from the banked coals, pulled the second wool blanket from the shelf and put it around Harlan's shoulders. Made tea in the small kettle, slow and deliberate, not too hot, because warming a severely cold man too quickly carried its own medical risks, and he understood that. He sat beside Harlan and gave him the tea and watched his color make its slow migration from the blue-white of dangerous cold towards something that carried more life in it. Harlan's hands shook badly around the cup but held it. He looked at the walls of the underground room, the sod bricks, the timber ceiling, the stove, the shelves of supplies. He turned his head slowly and looked at all of it with the exhausted, deliberate attention of a man working to understand where he is and how he came to be here. Then he looked at Caleb. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was rough and stripped of everything except the bare fact of what he was saying. "Edna," he said. Caleb held his gaze and did not look away from it. "I know," he said. Harlan looked at him for another moment. Then he looked down at the tea in his hands. He did not speak again for a long time after that, and Caleb did not try to fill the silence, because there are silences that must not be filled, that exist for the person inside them, and not for the comfort of the person observing them from outside. He had sat inside that kind of silence himself in Ohio, and he knew what it required. It required to be left alone. He left Harlan in the underground room with the fire built high, and the supplies within reach, and the instruction to stay and stay warm, given in the tone of a man who expects compliance not because of authority, but because the logic of the situation was obvious. Then he went back out into the Dakota morning to find out what the storm had left. The Strand property was 1.5 miles to the northeast. Caleb made the journey in just under 3 hours. The snow was deep, and the route crossed a section of low ground where the drifts had reached nearly to his shoulders in places. He moved through it with the same steady, methodical force he brought to everything that required sustained effort, without the option of stopping. What he found at the Strand property was not what he had found at the Bowers. Gunner Strand's cabin was damaged. A section of the roof on the north side had failed under the accumulated load, and snow had packed into that end of the structure until it was uninhabitable, but the walls were still standing. The barn, which Gunner had built lower and heavier than the cabin with a roof pitch designed to shed snow aggressively, had survived intact. Gunner and Britta had spent 4 days in the barn. He found them in the back corner of the structure, in the zone of warmth generated by the 2 horses and the milk cow that had shared the space with them. Gunner had frostbite on 3 toes of his left foot from a trip he had made from the barn to the cabin on the second day of the storm, misjudging the temperature and the time the short journey would take. Britta was cold and exhausted and entirely uninjured, and looked at Caleb when he came through the barn door with the expression of a woman who has survived something difficult and has already moved past the surviving into the assessment of what comes next. Gunner looked at him with the expressionless attention of a man in the early phase of calculating what his survival had cost. "Harlan," Gunner said, not a question. He had seen the direction Caleb had come from. "Alive," Caleb said. "In my root cellar, warming up." "Edna," Caleb shook his head. Gunner looked at the barn wall for a long moment, then back at Caleb. "Your cabin. Roof section came down. I was not in it." Gunner processed this with the unhurried thoroughness he brought to all information, working through the implications of what Caleb had just said, following the logical chain to its conclusion. "The dugout," Gunner said. "Yes." Gunner nodded once, the nod of a man acknowledging a fact he should have acknowledged months ago, and is now acknowledging without the defense of pretending it was a close call. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked. "With help." Then let's get you and Britta somewhere warm. He brought them to the underground room. 4 people in the space made it crowded, but crowded and warm was a different category of existence from spacious and dying, and no one present needed that distinction explained to them. Caleb built the fire higher and opened both ventilation shafts fully to manage the increased demand on the air supply. He put a pot of beans on the small stove, the stored dried beans with salt pork cut into it because hot food in this situation was not a comfort, but a medical necessity, and he knew the difference. Harlan and Gunnar sat on opposite sides of the underground room and looked at each other with the particular expression of 2 men who have come through the same event by completely different routes and have not yet worked out what to say about the distance between those roads. Britta Strand looked at the walls and the ceiling and the stove and the stock shelves with an expression that was conducting a rapid, unsentimental reassessment of several things she had believed to be true. She was 58 years old and had the direct manner of a woman who had spent decades in a hard country and had long since lost patience with dishonesty in any of its forms, including the dishonesty of maintaining a position she no longer actually held. "Who built this?" she asked. "I did," Caleb said, "when March through September, this year." She looked at him. The expression was several things at once: the reassessment, a recalibration of her understanding, and the early form of an acknowledgement she had not yet decided how to deliver. "I heard you had gone strange," she said. "I heard that too," Caleb said. She looked around the room one more time, then back at him. "You had not gone strange." "No." She nodded with the decisive finality of a woman who has completed a revision and is moving on from it. "Good. Now feed us." Over the 2 days that followed, as the snow gradually allowed movement and the territory began the slow, grim work of reestablishing contact between its scattered homesteads, Caleb went out to complete the accounting that had to be completed. He went south first toward the Denton property. Aldous Denton had 2 children, and the weight of that fact moved him faster than anything else could have. The Denton cabin had partially collapsed, the east wall had failed when the roof came down on that side, and the structure had folded inward in the direction of the failure. Caleb spent 40 minutes digging through debris and calling before he found Agnes Denton and her 2 children, Thomas 11 and Clara 8, in the ordinary root cellar beneath the cabin floor. A simple, practical, unambiguous root cellar accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen. Agnes had taken the children down there on the second night of the storm. When the roof had first begun making sounds she recognized as wrong. Agnes Denton was 45 years old and had the particular composure that only reveals itself in circumstances that demand it. She came up out of the root cellar with a child on each side and looked at Caleb Holt with eyes that had been crying and had stopped and had decided, in the way that certain women decide things permanently, that crying was finished for the present. "Aldous," she said. "I haven't found him yet," Caleb said. They found him an hour later beneath the collapsed east wall section. The evidence of his tracks in the snow, preserved by the cold, in the way tracks are preserved when nothing comes after them to disturb them, indicated he had gone to the barn and been returning when the wall failed. It had been fast. He would not have understood what was happening. Agnes stood at the site for a long time. Then she took her children's hands and walked with Caleb toward the west, toward the underground room where Harlan and the Strands were waiting, because the underground room was the only fully intact and fully warm structure in this part of the territory, and that was where the living needed to be. On the 3rd day, he went farther south. He went because the accounting was not complete until it was complete, and because a man who has built his life around looking clearly at what he would rather not see does not begin looking away at the moment when the looking is hardest. The Mercer homestead was 2 miles south. Wallace and Dorothy Mercer had come from Indiana 3 years ago. Wallace was 48, Dorothy 45. They had a daughter, Nora, 14. Caleb had encountered them a dozen times at the trading post at the occasional community gatherings. Wallace had helped him haul timber one August morning in 1874 without being asked and without asking for anything in return, which Caleb had noted and not forgotten, because he did not forget the things people did that required something from them. The Mercer cabin was standing, all of it, walls, roof, and a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney. Caleb stood at the property line and looked at that smoke and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tightened. Wallace opened the door before Caleb reached the cabin. He had seen him coming across the snow, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has survived something large and is still in the early stages of understanding the full shape of his survival. "Holt," he said, "Mercer, come in. Come in out of that cold." Inside the cabin showed the evidence of 4 hard days' furniture pushed close to the stove, blankets piled everywhere, the improvised quality of a space that had been used as a survival environment rather than a home. Dorothy was at the stove. Nora was in the corner with a book that she was not reading. They were alive, all 3 of them. Caleb sat at Wallace Mercer's table and drank coffee and told them what he had found and what he had not found, and watched their faces move through the sequence of responses that this information produced. Dorothy pressed her hand against her mouth when he told her about Edna Bauer. Nora looked at the table. Wallace looked at Caleb steadily. "How many?" he said. "I don't know the full count yet. In this immediate area, Edna Bauer, Aldous Denton, possibly others I haven't reached." He paused. "Across the territory, it's going to be significant." Wallace was quiet for a moment. "Then your cabin, the roof." "The main cabin roof section came down. I was not in it." Wallace looked at him. "The root cellar." "Yes." A longer silence. "Thought you had lost your mind," Wallace said, "when Aldous told us what you had built. I thought that man has had too many winters alone, and it has done something to him." "I know," Caleb said. "I was wrong." "Yes," Caleb said, without emphasis, without the quality of vindication that the word might have carried if the circumstances that had proven him right had been different ones. The full accounting took 3 weeks. As travel became possible and the network of homesteads reestablished its connections, the numbers came in gradually. A family here, a solitary homesteader there, the occasional larger tragedy where a cabin had failed completely and taken everyone inside it. 47 confirmed dead in the surrounding territory by the end of December. The number that would emerge from the more remote properties not yet accessible would be higher. Most had died when their cabins failed and they had nowhere to go. Some had died trying to reach a neighbor's property and running out of survivable time before they arrived. Every death was a version of the same death. Structural failure. No backup. Nowhere to retreat. The community gathered at Gunner Strand's barn on a Saturday morning in early January. 23 people. The temperature was 10 below and the sky was clear and offered no acknowledgement of what it had recently done. The barn was the largest intact structure available, and Gunner had opened it without being asked because that was the kind of man he was. There were 23 living people present, and there were absences, spaces where people had stood at previous gatherings defined now by the faces of those who were thinking about who was not here. Caleb Holt stood near the east wall of the barn and waited. He did not speak first. He had learned in 43 years that speaking first in a room full of people who are still arriving at their own understanding of something rarely helps anyone arrive faster. You let it come. You let people work their way to the question they are actually trying to ask rather than the question they think they are supposed to ask. It took time. There was grief first. The specific named grief of people saying aloud who they had lost: Edna Bauer, Aldous Denton, others whose names carried faces and histories that the people in this barn held in common. This was necessary, and it could not be shortened. There was shock second, the particular shock of people who have survived a thing they did not believe was coming, who are in the middle of revising their understanding of what the place they live in is capable of doing to them, and then gradually rising through the grief and the shock, the question that the grief and shock were both pointing toward. It was Roy Halverson who asked it. Roy was 40 years old and a homesteader from Minnesota who had come to Dakota Territory 2 years ago with his wife and 2 sons and had survived the storm by spending 4 days in his barn after his cabin became untenable. He was a straightforward man with the specific clarity of someone who has nearly died and is not interested in going through the experience again, a man who wanted to understand what had happened because understanding it was the only path to making sure it did not happen the same way again. "Holt," Roy said, "you survived in that underground room of yours." "Yes. While the rest of us were fighting to keep our cabins warm or sheltering in barns." "Yes." Roy looked at him steadily. "You told Harlan Bauer and Gunner Strand what you were building and why back in May. You explained that cabins could fail." "I did. And none of us built one." "No." Roy let that sit for a moment. Around the barn, 23 people were listening with the quality of attention that belongs to a room where something that matters is being established. "Why didn't you try harder to convince us?" Roy asked. His voice was entirely free of accusation. It was the voice of a man who is genuinely trying to understand a chain of events because understanding it is the only way to break that chain. "Why didn't you go to every property and make the case until people listened?" Caleb looked at him, then around the barn at the assembled faces. "How many of you heard through the summer that I had built a secret underground room and possibly lost my mind?" Most of the hands in the barn went up, straightforwardly, without reluctance or embarrassment, simply as a matter of fact. "How many of you heard that and thought that sounds like something I should investigate seriously and consider for myself?" The hands came down. Caleb nodded once. "I went to the three nearest men and told them directly face to face what I had built and exactly why I had built it. I explained the winters of 73 and 75 in detail. I explained the physics of how a cabin fails under extreme conditions. I answered every question they put to me." He paused. "And I want to ask one of those three men to tell you what he thought when he left." The barn was quiet. Gunner Strand straightened slightly from where he had been standing near the back wall, weight carefully off the frostbitten foot. He looked around the barn with the pale, careful eyes that had never been in a hurry and were not in a hurry now. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. He looked at Harlan Bauer, who was standing near the front of the gathering with the stillness of a man carrying a weight that had not finished settling. "He told us," Gunner said. His voice was flat and unhurried, stripped of drama, giving each word its plain weight without decoration. "In May, he showed us what he had built, and he explained his reasoning completely. He was clear, direct, and logical." Gunner paused for a long moment. "We thought he had become obsessive. We thought too many winters alone had affected his judgment. We told our families. Our families told their neighbors." He paused again. "We did not believe him. That is the truth of what happened. He told us, and we did not believe him, and that is the reason why none of us built a backup." The barn was very quiet. Harlan Bauer had been looking at the floor throughout this. Now he raised his head. Harlan was a man who had built his life on a foundation of fixed beliefs about how the world worked, about what adequate preparation looked like, about what constituted sound judgment, about the difference between prudence and obsession. The storm had taken a sledgehammer to that foundation and left him standing in what remained, trying to determine what was still usable and what had to be rebuilt from the ground. He had lost his wife. He had been pulled from the wreckage of his cabin by the man he had dismissed as paranoid. He had spent 2 days in the underground room that he had mocked, warming his hands at the stove he had called excessive eating from the stores he had called the product of an unwell mind. He had thought about all of this during those 2 days with a thoroughness that a man applies to things that have cost him the most. "I said he'd spent too many winters alone," Harlan said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold anymore. "I told my wife he was building something dark, something the mind produces when it has been isolated too long and starts to see danger everywhere." He stopped. "My wife." He stopped again. No one spoke. "There is something I have not told anyone," Harlan said. His voice had changed. The roughness was still there, but underneath it now was something that had been kept locked for 3 years and had decided it was done being kept. January of 73, the cold Caleb described, 42 below for 6 days. The barn was completely still. I burned through 2 weeks of firewood in 5 days. On the fourth night, I was burning the legs off my kitchen table. I was wearing everything I owned and still losing heat faster than I could generate it. He paused. "I never told anyone that, not Edna, not any of you. I told myself it was just a hard stretch, that everyone went through the same thing, that it didn't mean anything beyond the fact that it had been a severe winter." His voice dropped lower, but in the silence of the barn, it carried to every corner of it. "When Caleb told us in May what he had built and why I knew he was right, I knew it the way you know something you have been trying not to think about, not as new information, but as the name for something that had been sitting in you without a name for 3 years." He paused one more time. "And I still didn't build one. Because admitting he was right meant admitting that what I had survived in 73 was not a hard stretch. It meant admitting that I had nearly died in my own cabin and had not told my wife and had not done anything about it." His voice was very flat now. "I chose my pride over the preparation. and Edna paid the cost of that choice. The barn was silent. Harlan looked at Caleb directly with the direct, stripped-down gaze of a man who has completed the most difficult accounting he has ever had to do. He was right, Harlan said. Not partially right, not right about some of it. Right. The cabins can fail, they did fail, and the man who understood that and built accordingly is standing there, and I am standing here because he dug me out of the wreckage of mine. He paused. I owe him a debt I don't know how to measure. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Build a dugout, Caleb said. That's the debt. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions belong to stories, and this was not a story, it was a life. And lives do not resolve cleanly. They accumulate. They carry the weight of the things that happened in them, the losses and the decisions and the moments when a man had his hand on a door at 2 in the morning and took it off again, and all of that weight goes forward with the man, whether he chooses to carry it or not. Caleb Holt went forward with it. He went forward with the knowledge of what he had gotten right, the preparation, the building, the reading of the beam in the attic at 3 in the morning, the 15 minutes of purposeful movement through the cabin before the roof came down. He carried that, and he went forward with the other thing, the sound through the ventilation shaft, the hand on the door, and the decision to take it off the door. That night would not be resolved into something that could be cleanly evaluated and put away. He had made the only rational decision available to him. He knew this. He would know it for the rest of his life. And he would also hear that sound through the shaft at 2 in the morning for the rest of his life, at intervals in the specific quiet that comes in the small hours. And he would sit with it the way you sit with things that do not resolve. Some things do not reconcile. They simply coexist inside a man, the knowledge of what he got right and the weight of what it cost sitting side by side in the dark. He carried both. Through January, he helped Harlan Bauer begin the excavation of an emergency dugout into the hillside east of where the Bauer cabin had been. The new main cabin, which Harlan and 3 neighbors built in February, when the temperature rose enough to allow the work, was positioned with the dugout entrance 30 yards to the east of it, connected by a covered passage, because Harlan Bauer was not a man who made the same mistake twice. And he had the particular motivation of a man who understood precisely what the mistake had cost. In the spring of 1877, Caleb helped Roy Halverson with his dugout. Then the Strand family with a larger version capable of sheltering the full household for an extended period. Then Agnes Denton, who had decided to stay on her homestead with her children because leaving would have required her to leave Aldous as well, and she was not prepared to do that. Then 3 other families across a broader radius as the story of the winter of 1876 traveled through the territory and reached men who had not been present for the storm, but had heard about it in the specific way that stories about catastrophes travel with enough detail to be convincing and enough authority to motivate action. He told them without editorializing. He described the dimensions, the materials, the ventilation design, the thermal properties of Earth at this depth. He answered questions with the precision of a man who had thought through every detail before he began and had spent months refining the execution. He showed them the mistakes that others made in early attempts. Martin Kessler, who excavated in low ground and watched his dugout fill with spring meltwater and had to start over in a better location. Sarah Henders, who didn't ventilate properly and found her stove wouldn't draw, and the air in the room became dangerous and had to modify the design entirely. He told them what not to do as precisely as he told them what to do, because the failures were as instructive as the successes, and a man who only taught what worked was a man withholding half of what his students needed. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "If you had listened in May." He did not say any of the things a man in his position might have been entitled to say, because there was no version of saying those things that helped anyone, and because the help was the only point. He had read Margaret's words by lantern light in the underground room during the storm, and he had understood something he had not understood before about the relationship between what she was saying and what it actually meant. Stop looking for the thing that will go wrong. She had meant it as gentle advice offered with love to a man whose particular temperament tilted toward the difficult and the preparatory rather than the comfortable and the trusting. She had not been wrong about the tendency she was naming. She had been wrong about what the tendency was for. A man who stops looking for the thing that will go wrong does not thereby prevent it from going wrong. He simply stops being ready for it. The world does not modify his behavior to to accommodate a man's decision to look away from its harder possibilities. The beam cracks in the middle of the night regardless of whether the man sleeping below it has thought about the possibility or refused to think about it. The only difference is what happens after the crack. He had been looking the way a carpenter looks because understanding the failure point of a structure is not pessimism, is not fear, is not the morbid product of isolation. It is the specific earned knowledge that makes it possible to build something that can be trusted. You cannot build reliably for what you refuse to understand. She had been gentle, and she had been loving, and she had been his wife, and he had missed her every day since January 1866 in the particular persistent way of missing someone who was irreplaceable and knew it. And in this specific matter, he had been right and she had been wrong, and he held both of those things at the same time in the same hands without asking them to become a single coherent thing. Because they were not a single coherent thing. They were two true things that happened to exist in the same man's life side by side, the way most true things exist without resolution, without the courtesy of a clear conclusion. He carried all of it forward. He rebuilt the main cabin in the spring of 1877. He used better timber selected with more care than he had given to the original. He used a main beam of larger cross-section with a secondary support he had designed during the long hours of the winter, a structural modification that distributed the center span load across two elements, rather than one, eliminating the single point of failure that the winter of 1876 had revealed. He improved the roof pitch to shed snow more aggressively under accumulation. He reinforced the chinking with a mixture he had researched and tested more resistant to the thermal cycling that opened gaps over time. He built it well. He had always built things well, but he built this one with the particular attention of a man who has understood something about the limits of even well-built things and has designed accordingly. And when it was finished, he walked around to the back of the property and stood at the entrance to the underground room and looked at it for a while. He did not fill it in. He did not convert it to something else or let it fall into disuse. He kept it exactly as it had been on the morning of December 9th, 1876, when he had come through the passage and closed the door behind him. Stock stove-ready passage, functional, both ventilation shafts clear. He checked it every fall the way a man checks a tool he relies on with the attention that a reliable tool deserves and rarely receives. He never needed it again. But knowing it was there, knowing that 30 yards behind his cabin in the side of a south-facing hill on the Dakota Plateau, there existed a space that the storm could not reach and the cold could not penetrate, and the structural failures of surface construction could not compromise, gave him something that the main cabin, for all its quality and craftsmanship and the care he had brought to every inch of it, had never managed to give him. It gave him the particular peace of a man who has looked clearly at what the world is capable of doing and has prepared for it honestly, and has nothing left to prove to anyone about whether the preparation was warranted. That peace was not nothing. For a man who had spent most of his adult life looking at the failure points of things, it was not a small thing at all. He stayed on the homestead until 1891. By then he was 62 years old, and the physical demands of farming had begun to cost him in ways he chose to acknowledge honestly, rather than deny, consistent with the approach he had taken to most things throughout his life. He sold the property to a young family from Iowa who had heard there was good land available and had not heard enough of the story of the 1876 blizzard to be appropriately cautious about it. He spent a day walking them through the property, showing them the underground room, explaining its construction and its purpose and the conditions under which it would be needed. The husband listened politely. The wife asked several questions that were better questions than the husband's. Caleb told them everything they needed to know. He moved to a small house in the nearest town where his daughter had settled with her husband and two children, and he spent the years that remained to him doing carpentry, smaller work, now furniture and repairs, and the occasional small structure, work that suited the particular quality of attention he had always brought to wood, and the hidden interior of things now applied to smaller canvases and with less urgency, but with no less care. He was known in town as a skilled man and a quiet one. People who knew his history occasionally asked him about the winter of 1876 because the story had become one of those regional stories that a place holds on to, polished by repetition into something that retained the shape of what happened, but had been smoothed of most of its specific texture. He answered their questions accurately and without drama because that was how he answered all questions. He died in the spring of 1897. He was 68 years old. He died in a warm room in the house where his daughter lived, and the last winter he had experienced had been a January cold snap of 16 below that rattled the windows of the townhouse and passed in 3 days without incident and without requiring him to prepare anything at all. The homestead passed through two more families over the following decades, each making their changes and additions and modifications in the way that properties accumulate the evidence of everyone who has ever lived on them. The family that owned it in the 1920s, clearing and improving the land for more intensive agricultural use, found the underground room in the hillside behind the main cabin, by then rebuilt twice from the 1877 version, and decided it was a liability and filled it in. The hillside returned to the appearance of an ordinary south-facing Dakota slope in late spring, brown grass, a few rocks, the unremarkable topography of high plains country that had absorbed what had been built into it and showed no sign of what it had once contained. The covered passage entrance was gone. The concealed ventilation shafts were gone. The stovepipe that had looked like a natural rock outcropping from 30 feet away was gone. There are photographs. A traveling photographer came through the territory around 1885, having heard the story and documented the property while the structure was still visible and intact. In the photographs, the hillside looks like any other hillside in the region. If you know where to look, if someone has marked the location with a penciled annotation on the back of the print, you can find the entrance, a slightly darker rectangle in the slope, where the sod facing could not quite make the outline invisible under direct afternoon light. You could walk past it 50 times and never know what it was. That was intentional. Caleb Holt had built his dugout to be invisible for the same reason any man builds a thing he knows others will not understand until it is too late, because the value of a refuge is not diminished by the mockery of people who cannot see why it is needed, and is not enhanced by their eventual understanding, but exists entirely and only in what it does when the conditions that required its construction finally arrive. It does the thing it was built to do. The man who built it is inside it, warm and alive, while the storm does its work above him. They called him crazy in the spring. They called him obsessive through the summer and watched him with the particular combination of suspicion and pity that a small community reserves for a man who has departed from the consensus about how things should be done and refuses to return to it. They said among themselves through the fall that too many winters spent alone had done something to his thinking that isolation does to certain kinds of men, that his judgment had turned inward in a way that had disconnected it from the shared understanding of what was reasonable and what was not. And then the blizzard came, and the roofs came down, and 47 people died in structures that everyone agreed were adequate in a winter that everyone agreed was survivable, because everyone's agreement about what was adequate and what was survivable turned out to be a conversation that the weather had not been invited to participate in, and the weather had its own position on the question and stated it without ambiguity. And Caleb Holt, the man with the secret hole in the hill, the man who had looked at the failure point of the structures around him and built accordingly, and kept it secret because he understood what people would say if he built it openly, Caleb Holt came out of the earth 4 days later and walked through the snow to find out who was left. There is nothing triumphant in that. There is only the plain, unsentimental fact of it. He saw what could go wrong. He prepared for it. He survived it. And he spent the years that remained to him teaching the men around him to do the same, not because he needed their validation, not because he required the acknowledgement that he had been right and they had been wrong, but because the preparation was knowable and the knowledge was transferable, and the alternative to transferring it was more fields of collapsed roofs and more Dakota mornings of that specific silence. He had heard what that silence sounded like. He had heard it from inside the earth through a ventilation shaft in the middle of a killing night, when the temperature was 30 below and the distance between a man and survival was measured not in miles but in weather he had months earlier, on an ordinary morning in March, looked clearly at what could go wrong and then picked up a shovel and done something about it. Some men see what others refuse to look at. They pay a price for seeing it in the social costs of building what others call unnecessary, in the isolation of understanding something, before the evidence is available to confirm it, in the particular loneliness of preparation, in a world that rewards confidence in the status quo. And on the days when what they saw finally arrives, when the thing they prepared for shows up in its full and undeniable reality, they are already underground, already warm, already on the other side of the question that always mattered more than any of the others. Are you prepared for what is coming? Caleb Holt was. That was the whole of it. That was enough.